Good afternoon and welcome to Building Equity, Leveling the Playing Field Through Land Reuse and How to Know You're Doing It Well. My name is Claire Weston. I am the Programs and Operations Manager at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Before I pass it off to our incredible panel of speakers, let me just introduce you to the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. To this end, we educate, advocate, assist, and convene stakeholders to revitalize communities through land recycling. We are also the US EPA's technical assistance to brownfields provider for 10 states and numerous territories around the country. So how do we help you? We provide one-on-one technical assistance. We organize national webinars like this one. We host workshops and conferences, hopefully to be in person very soon. And we disseminate newsletters and online resources. We take you through the entire process of redevelopment, the full roadmap. That includes getting you started by giving you the tools and connections to plan your redevelopment, by helping you stay on track by offering current information and expert advice on funding, remediation, community engagement to meet your milestones. And we also assist in helping you get the job done by sharing common documents such as RFPs and marketing sheets, and introducing you to peers, industry experts, and developers. I want to give a special thank you to APA Upstate New York for accrediting this webinar. AICP certified planners who complete this webinar can receive 1 certification maintenance credit. AICP members should report those credits the same way you would for a live event through your APA CM log. In addition, please indicate in the post-broadcast survey if you are a certified planner seeking credit. This panel is meant to be engaging and interactive. So our panelists will not be sharing any PowerPoints or visuals. Rather, it'll follow a roundtable format driven by questions prepared by our lovely moderator, as well as questions that you will pose as the audience. To ask a question, you can type it in the lower box of your dashboard, highlighted here. Additionally, we have posted several handouts with some key resources provided by our panelists. You can access those also in your dashboard in the tab titled Handouts. Additionally, you can find a technical difficulties troubleshooting guide if you run into any problems. All right, I think that's all for me. So at this point, I'm actually going to hand it over to our wonderful moderator, Cate Mingoya. She is the Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA. Take it away, Cate.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thank you to all of you who are taking time out of your day to be with us. I know that we've been very many months in the Zoomiverse, so I'm really thankful that you took the time to be here. Equity is kind of the hot word right now. I don't necessarily like to frame it that way, but it kind of is, and you probably have some questions. When we're thinking about equitable land reuse, whose responsibility is it? And what does equitable land reuse really look like? And how do you know if you've done it well? So I'm really thrilled that today we're going to have a roundtable, fly on the wall, fireside chat, hanging out in a bar type conversation with some really fantastic folks who I'd like to invite to come on camera. Today we've got Lily Song, who's the founding coordinator of Harvard CoDesign, Smita Rawoot, who is the urban resilience lead at the World Resources Institute, and Stephen Gray, who's the principal of Grayscale Collaboratives. And I love how everybody just like came on when they were called in like that, very theatrical. What we're going to start with is everyone's going to tell us a little bit about themselves, a little bit about the way that they view equity in land reuse, land use work that they do. And then we're going to have a series of questions. And as Claire said, I highly encourage you to throw questions big and small, challenging and simple, sassy and banal into the chat so that we can have a little bit extra fodder. I'll be keeping my eyes on it. But I'm going to just kick it off and pass it over to Lily.
Great, thanks, Cate. So by way of introduction, I'm an urban planning practitioner, researcher, and educator, most recently based at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and now moving over to Northeastern as assistant professor of race and social justice in the built environment. And I want to start today by sharing my favorite quote, or question, I should say, from the great community builder and movement architect, Grace Lee Boggs. What does it mean to be a human in the 21st century? So we know the 21st century is a time of grave physical and existential threats from climate change, global pandemics, winner-take-all markets, and vast socioeconomic disparities. And it's also a time of movements for Black lives, queer liberation, climate justice, regenerative commons, and more. So some questions that come up for me that I'd like to share today is, as planners and designers, what does it mean to be a human in the 21st century? How can we do the inner and relational work needed to bring our best selves to our life's work and our planetary work? How do we shift our methods and practices to align with existing efforts to decolonize, decommodify, and demilitarize, that is, humanize the built environment and social relations? Cate asked us to speak about our purpose and priorities. Well, I see my purpose as using my creative powers as a planner to accomplish frontline communities and organizers who are already leading the charge to repair, heal, nourish communities, commons, and the planet. So it's less community engagement or social impact design and more solidarity work that draws on the planners and designers toolkit, something I call sistering. And why do I think that movement aligned or movement-based planning and design is important? Well, as we've seen with sustainability initiatives, when those with the biggest stake in the status quo are driving infrastructure and land reuse, they often function as yet another vehicle of economic growth, which further encloses wealth and land, differentially values human worth, and commodifies much of urban life. And you know, so many cities now have packaged and propagated sustainability improvements in transit, bikeways, public spaces, to make their spaces more attractive to so-called creatives, who in turn attract knowledge and service sectors, which boost real estate values and living costs in core urban areas. And the result reinforces consumptive lifestyles of those who are already most privileged by the extractive economy. You know, it expands their claims to urban space and then spurs displacement pressures. So alternatively, you know, more movement-aligned planning has the potential to center the needs and visions of historically marginalized groups, particularly when they're led by them, groups such as low-income communities of color whose ongoing contributions to urban areas and sustainable lifeways are commonly overlooked or even pathologized. And I see this as a way to counteract the prevailing mode of displacement urbanism. And as for my priority issue, it's decommodifying critical urban infrastructures like housing, transport, food, energy, and water, which to me means reclaiming them as basic human rights, as opposed to market commodities available to the highest bidder. And you know, like the 21st century is a time of so much wealth and technological advances, and we could afford for people to have baseline life necessities regardless of race, income, or status that they were born into otherwise. So as cities and regions with state and federal support through the American Rescue Plan and hopefully the Jobs Plan undertake serious infrastructure and redevelopment projects in the coming years, there's such an opportunity to repair not only the built environments that we live in, but also the logics of urban spatial development and management away from sort of the supremacist profiteering and carceral sort of logics. And finally, I'll get to my living example that I want to share, which is the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, which I've worked with in the past, broad-based coalition engaging in grassroots organizing, community economic development, affordable housing development, transit justice, public health, and environmental justice, and policy and legal advocacy in the LA region. And they include a lot of different sort of civil society groups that grew out of the LA-based community benefits movement. And last summer, ACT LA leaders invited my research team, CoDesign, to accomplish their advocacy campaign, which is called Divest to Invest, alongside other university-based allies, such as the Veterans Legal Clinic at UCLA and the Movement Lawyering Clinic at Howard University. And our task as planners and designers was to propose environmental design and strategies, spatial strategies that made metro spaces feel safe to people without police first sort of defensive measures. And the campaign, which is aligned with Black Lives Matter LA and People's Budget LA, is actually making headway, shifting funding from LA Metro's multi-agency law enforcement contract, it's one of the nation's biggest, to critical investments in social services, transit stations, public spaces, et cetera, that promote more holistic conditions of safety for all LA County residents. And amongst the resources that are being shared, there's the Metro as a Sanctuary report, which shares out some of the which is the policy proposal for Divest to Invest. And you'll also find ACT LA's Planning for Equity resources, which are specific to the LA region, but can be adapted. And specifically for planning and design professionals, there's 2 practitioner resources that come out of CoDesign, which I led for the past 2 years. And these include the Design Studio First Aid Kit, which has 6 W questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how, that interrogates and informs how we're going about the design process. So this is something I often use at the outset of a project to sort of structure it. It attends to, our positionality, biases and blind spots, intended and unintended impacts, politics of place, and planning ethics. And the other piece, Just Don't, lays out common pitfalls and strategies for equity practitioners. So I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Lily, and I'll pass it over to you, Smita.
Thank you, Cate. It's great to be here. And, just to introduce myself, I'm Smita Rawoot. I'm the Urban Resilience Lead at the World Resources Institute. And I'm really glad to be here because, the key questions front and center for me as an urban resilience practitioner are how, as planners, as we plan for future and emerging risks, how do we make sure that we do not forget the past harms and inequities as we design climate adaptation plans and climate mitigation plans in the future? How can we critically ensure that equity is built into all our climate action strategies and plans? Because as you all know, and no one in this audience needs to be reminded, climate impacts are going to hurt the most vulnerable the most. They don't have the coping capacities to or the resources to address the risks and losses that they will face. And they often are the communities who have done the least to contribute to the challenges that are emerging. So how can we ensure that as we go forward in developing the mitigation and adaptation strategies, we prioritize the marginalized communities, make sure we address their needs, make sure we build resilience of those communities, and look at climate and socioeconomic vulnerability assessment together as one complement. There are many emerging practices in this area. WRI, for example, themselves, we created a framework for urban community resilience assessment called the UCRA framework, which looks at vulnerability at 3 different levels, the household level, the neighborhood level, and the city level, because differentiated vulnerabilities amongst community and right up to the household levels matter in how climate risks will impact them and how they will be able to cope. And, we really need to take that human-centered approach in designing future actions that we propose. So these are considerations that are key in my mind. There are many other things, of course, but I'm sure we'll get into those as we have a discussion. So pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Smita. Stephen?
Great, thanks for having us. So I'm Stephen Gray. I have a practice, Grayscale Collaborative, urban design planning, and I also am an associate professor of urban design at Harvard Graduate School of Design. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to build on some of the sort of context and framing that Lily and Smita sort of laid out. You know, we really can't talk about physical infrastructures in the United States without also talking about race. And this is something that my good friend Lily Song always reminds us of, and actually sort of has helped me to think about my framing in that way. And the design of cities ends up tending to concentrate resources in some places and marginalize communities in others. And while the particular histories and policies, practices, built projects that produce these kind of socio-spatial divisions vary by territory and even internationally may vary by context, the lines of separation invariably demarcate differences in race, ethnicity, caste, and class. And so the relationship between space and these politically constructed forms of identity inform where people live or don't live, determine their relative access to resources and opportunities, define the power dynamics involved in how spaces are used and governed. And over time, they produce material consequences, both negative, but also in the form of new identities, which are rooted in these physical and cultural geographies. And so it's important to recognize that when we are trying to make interventions that are meant to be positive for folks, that sometimes solidarity is more important than integration, and so we need to make sure we have a nuanced understanding of the context and the situation that people are in. So, you know, as Lily mentioned, we're currently experiencing these colliding public health emergencies. COVID-19 is finally starting to subside a little bit in this country, but also our sort of reckoning with systemic racism. And both have public health, public policy, and urban design implications, and both are overwhelmingly harming and killing people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people. And this was not inevitable. You know, as we know, the coronavirus does not discriminate. But where it's lacking in racial bias, the United States has made up for with a resilient and highly adaptive white supremacist capitalist racial ideology, which has justified spatial and economic exclusion through segregation and redlining, racial terrorism through Jim Crow laws and community massacres. The Tulsa example is a headline news right now. Community theft through blockbusting and predatory lending, targeted community removal through urban renewal and federal highway programs, the criminalization of Blackness and loss of voting rights and citizenship through mass incarceration and deportation, or simply blanket ethnic exclusion. But still, many planners, designers, and policymakers operate with an economic impact imperative, ignoring the real social implications, good, bad, or otherwise, that our decisions have for society. So what we actually need to address social inequities is a form of radical redistribution of resources, understanding that there are under-resourced communities and that they shouldn't have to move to get those investments and resources, but also to redistribute opportunities so that in the highly resourced parts of cities, there are opportunities for people who don't necessarily live there to live there or to work there or to be a part of the public realm. And ultimately a redistribution of power. So this requires acknowledging the sort of intersectionality of race, class, and the production of space, interrogating our contributions to and complicity with structural and infrastructural racism, and developing methodologies and interventions to address issues of racial injustice. So the focus of my research and practice is really on spatializing and rectifying social inequities through these processes of radical inclusion and design intermediation by exploring new ways to do just that, redistribute resources, redistribute opportunities, and redistribute power. And so the example that I'll give of work, which is a bit of a sort of a praxis project, it's sort of on the cusp of both my research and my practice, is work with the Highline Network. And you know, the Highline Network is essentially a network of infrastructure reuse projects across the country that was established by the Highline as a way to reckon with some of the mistakes that they made or the oversight that they had on the project, which led to really accelerated gentrification and displacement. And you know, as we know, the deployment of landscape interventions to aestheticize high-end speculative developments has rarely resulted in broader publicness, even in spite of a presumed design ethos that is eminently public. So questions that arise are really about the main beneficiaries of these large-scale urban projects. How are contributions to or detractions from the public sphere measured? Under what conditions might well-designed public spaces strengthen our collective right to the city? And really answering these questions depends on who holds the power. Large projects like the High Line reinforce the power of capital, support real estate speculation, and ultimately lead to gentrification and displacement. And it leaves designers on the sidelines really kind of celebrating design interventions and innovations, but really kind of accelerating social and income disparities, increasing private property values, and undermining affordability by expelling long-standing residents with limited means in those situations. So soon after opening, Friends of the High Line recognized some of these challenges and issues, and they actually noticed that less than a quarter of the New Yorkers that visited the High Line were people of color. So the first thing that they did was institute a targeted public programs agenda, capitalizing on the High Line's success and ability to fundraise, and really focusing those programs on specific groups and specific spaces, sometimes not even on the High Line itself, and were able to double the number of visitors of color. But their real achievement came in 2017 with the founding of the High Line Network. This is a translocal advocacy and knowledge sharing network that is really built around anticipating and confronting gentrification and social exclusion in similar projects in other cities around the country. And really, so the High Line now stands at the center of this kind of intercity knowledge production through peer learning that extends far beyond the physical, temporal, and geographic footprint of the High Line itself. So in 2019, I began work with the network as well as with Urban Institute to develop an equitable impacts framework. There are 15 pilot organizations that we've been working with over the last 2 years, really helping those organizations to define and expand their equity agendas. And one of the things that was really apparent right from the start, even to the organizations themselves, was that they were never going to achieve equity externally until their internal governance, decision-making, and budgetary structures of power changed. And so, we've worked with them really to think about their projects beyond the physical boundaries of the site itself and the impacts that they're going to have on the surrounding neighborhoods in terms of employment and economic opportunity, housing affordability, neighborhood connectivity, health and well-being, cultural preservation, and the overall demographic makeup. And so the recommendations have really focused on new programs and partnerships, as well as I said, helping them think beyond their physical and disciplinary boundaries of open space projects. I'll leave it there and invite the conversation.
Neat. Thanks so much, everyone. So thrilled. So I want to speak to all the folks who are listening in. Two quick things. One, Claire wanted me to remind everyone that this is being recorded. It will be posted on the CCLR website, just so you know. And then the second piece is we heard a lot about the challenges that we're facing. And one of the things that I'm really thrilled about for this conversation is that we're going to collectively answer the, so what do we do about it? Now that I'm depressed, now that I'm crying, now that I know that the world is in like some kind of way, what do we do about it? And I want to kick off with a question. A lot of these systems of harm are designed and they're funded at the federal level and at the municipal level. They're designed, they're funded, they're maintained. Redlining was brought up as an example. Urban renewal was brought up as an example. What roles and responsibilities do practicing planners and redevelopers have in mitigating historical harm in our cities through land reuse? What are the roles and responsibilities that we have as practitioners?
Well, I would maybe extend the question to, what roles and responsibilities do we have as informed or informable and conscious and hopefully conscientious citizens of the world. And then you can answer the question through the lens of your particular discipline. I mean, recognizing, as we now have the first president who has publicly recognized structural racism as a problem in this country, recognizing that and then understanding that being a good person and having good intentions is not the same as recognizing an existing infrastructure which is going to automatically disadvantage certain people, and then applying intentionality to the way that we work is the only way that we're actually going to make any headway on these issues. And in fact, if we just go about our lives being a good person and not doing bad things, the end result tends to be bad for non-white residents of this country, and more melanin presenting residents of the world. And so I think, you know, it's a good question, but my short answer, I guess, is to have intentionality, to really think about what are the issues in the world that and in our work that we should be addressing, and to center those issues and to center the people who have the most lived experience around those issues in the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Cate, for that question. I just wanted to jump in on something that Stephen mentioned earlier, which was, you know, rethinking as planners, rethinking what these large infrastructure or redevelopment projects mean, and what are some alternate ways. I really think we need to rethink what are some new typologies for infrastructure, and that we need to think of, which can be more you know, community owned, more decentralized, more offer more sustainable benefits. You know, just to give a tangible example, you know, we launched this Accelerate Access Coalition in India, where we are focusing on improving water and sanitation access to urban poor communities while addressing the water risks that these communities face from climate change. And one of the things we are deliberately moving away from is saying that the centralized piped infrastructure is the only solution. Actually, the centralized pipe infrastructure is highly capital intensive, is unsustainable, uses a large amount of energy for distribution, treatment, and you know, and often there are structural impediments on how that investment is made, which never gets to urban poor communities. And so we are really thinking, and there's now a lot of research on how we can think of decentralized wastewater management, how we can think of off-grid, you know, sanitation systems, how we can link the nature-based wastewater treatment facilities for reuse and of water within the community. So and these can be community-owned, or they can have decentralized forms of governance, which can give more ownership and more ability to manage at the local level. So, I mean, this is just one example, but of course, we have heard of community-owned microgrids from the energy sector now becoming other areas of improvement. So I think as we think of redevelopment opportunities and you know, initiatives, we should really think of new ways of thinking about infrastructure, more hybrid infrastructures, which change the power dynamics in the way these infrastructures are managed, distributed, and invested on in the long term. And you know, it's great news that a lot of these systems are actually much more sustainable. So they address multiple benefits at multiple scales. They can initiate place-based advantages, which improve livability, improve and address many other issues. So I think, you know, just something I think we all should be thinking about as we think of new opportunities for communities.
If I could just chime in now and say also, Smita, how excited I am about decentralized and more plural forms of urban infrastructure governance and development. But I also want to give a shout out to the public planners and those who are operating within the public sector and say how important that is. and how we can't forego public accountability and leadership. It's very important to do this in a relational way where we're supporting these plural forms of infrastructure governance and planning and development, and regulating as well on very powerful and, sort of strong global corporations that, own infrastructures and service them. So just wanted to make that point. But I also wanted to say, when we talk about the roles and responsibilities of planners, I think and I guess I was getting there, is to really, it's important to think about it in a relational way and a collective way, so that it's not like power over communities or decision over people, but like with, and that's something that is very exciting for me. And I see a lot of planners and policymakers moving in those directions. And to Stephen's point, I also wanted to make the distinction between, we often talk about historical harms as if they've been done, but the legacies that are living, the displacement effects of green infrastructure right now are because of redlining, because of subprime lending, because of the historical dispossession that resulted in a wealth gap. And, that's the other side of the coin of suburbanization, defense industries, economic opportunities, public education, all surpassing communities of color, in the urban core and going to these outlying areas that were exclusive. And a lot of those living conditions sort of being entrenched and continuing. So it continues today, which is why I agree with Stephen that we can't just, we're either against it or we're for it.
But since you brought us into the green gentrification space, Celia, let's just dive in. If we're talking about everything from from the soil up, the topic on a lot of people's mind, including the municipal folks, the planners and the developers and nonprofits that we have as audience members on this call today, is green gentrification. How do we improve neighborhoods and get them the shade equity they deserve, the air quality that they deserve, the recreation spaces that they deserve, without pushing residents out? And there's no panacea, there's no 100% solution, but I'm curious, how do you folks think about issues of gentrification in your work, and what sort of skills and 1% solutions should planners and developers and nonprofit folks bring to this land reuse conversation to push back against this threat? Is there anything that we can do? Or are we completely helpless in the face of this? Is it either barren wasteland or trees with high profits? How do we think about this?
I can start us off. I mean, I think one thing I just want to say is that we all need to make sure the anti-displacement measures are integrated in a deliberate way right up front in project plans, redevelopment plans. They can't be an afterthought. They need to be front and center. We need to make sure it doesn't unfold and then it doesn't become a stopgap measure later, because that's often ineffective. It's always playing catch up to what market forces unleash. So that's one thing. And then, of course, creating more of an enabling environment for community-led initiatives and redevelopment projects would be another approach to take. Now, of course, the scale of those initiatives might vary, but some cities are now. I remember the work we did with a couple of partners from Street Plans and IOB, where we worked with the city of New Orleans to actually change the city regulatory system and guidelines to enable more community-led green infrastructure improvements at a citywide scale. How to create that enabling environment for community organizations and communities to directly take ownership of the mitigation measures. And there are regulatory barriers and guidelines that don't allow that. So how can
what do you think the benefits of that are? Why would we? I mean, why would we prioritize that? What's the benefit of that over having it be a top-down structure? What are some of the benefits that you see?
I think it's about, I think it's about creating ownership within your community, creating awareness, and in the end, creating agency. As you improve community experience and knowledge of doing this kind of work by themselves, you enable them to then think about these processes when other kind of top-down projects are initiated. And they know how to engage with those processes much better by just improving their capacity to engage in projects themselves. So I think it serves multiple purposes, and it cannot be looked at in just the singular impact that it has at a small scale. It needs to be looked at as a buildup of capacity and knowledge and agency to take ownership in your community. So that, I think, is one of the fundamental values of doing that, or initiating processes like that as well. And I think the other thing I just wanted to mention from previous conversations is we also need to think about how, and I'm specifically now thinking of post-disaster communities where there's a lot of displacement caused by climate impacts and things like that. One of the tensions there, and planners need to think about that as well, is one of the tensions there is to build back soon and build back as is, and how can we also ensure that, as we build back in those situations, we build back for the better and we build back for the long term, and we don't, create the kind of similar spatial segregations that have put those communities there in the first place. And this is a larger issue that is about national programs, recovery programs, and all the money that goes into programs post-disasters that we need to really think of. And what is the nature of redevelopment that happens there? How can that money, in fact, be used upfront for proactive adaptation and proactive, strategies for mitigating some of the risks that the communities, especially marginalized communities, face. So I think, and again, giving that agency and prioritization early on in the process would be one way of approaching it.
I kind of want to build on that a little bit and reinforce. And I heard two things that I think are really important to think about. One is obviously the sharing of power and agency, and making sure that the people who are the intended beneficiaries get to decide what's going to benefit them most. And that means having control over budgets. That means being at the table and making a decision on what the project is going to be framed as before an RFP is even drafted, not coming and showing up to the community process when there's a project that's already been well defined and mostly out of reach to make much change to at that point anyway. So that's one thing, is the agency. The other thing I heard, Smita, was anticipating change, anticipating outcomes from this investment, and finding ways to make sure that change is not harmful, and in fact maybe could be captured and leveraged to be beneficial. HRNA did a recent study that showed that of a number of parks that they looked at, investing in park infrastructure increased the property values and the cost of housing by 5 to 40% in the immediate vicinity. So if you're a parks advocate, you're an open space advocate, and you're thinking only within the boundaries of that specific space that you're looking at and not understanding its connection to the larger systems, then you're going to end up potentially doing more harm than help. And so anticipating that, because the market's real, and putting things in place, as you said, Smita, in advance to capture the value that's created, is exactly what the Highline Network is really all about, is helping projects that are in earlier stages of development anticipate their own success and plan for that. And the other half is really thinking about getting people onto the governance boards and onto the sort of decision-making bodies internally as well, so that the internal decisions are made with and mostly by the communities that are impacted. I'm working on a project with the Emerald Necklace Conservancy in Boston. In 2022, it's Olmsted's 200th birthday anniversary. And so all of the Olmsted parks in the country are all sort of thinking about what they want to do for this. And many of them are doing archival projects and trying to sort of remember the legacy of Olmsted. In Boston, they really want to understand the legacy of Olmsted and how that projects and translates into the 21st century. So really thinking about so what we're doing is we are designing a process where the community members and the organizations around the park, which represent those of highest need but have the least power and representation in the typical decision-making structure and orders of the Emerald Necklace Park system, are going to be the central body for governing and deciding all decisions made about community grant making. Every dollar that's spent will be decided by this body. And in fact, we are identifying the first few members of this body based upon our networks and who we know are doing work. And that group is going to then identify the rest of the people that should be working together towards the decision making. And then we're going to just basically be fundraising on the side to get them the cash so they can decide how they want to distribute it. And it's meant to be an experiment that can be a learning space, so that what the lessons are that we learn, what works well, we can actually apply to the Emerald Necklace Conservancy board structure, to their structure of overseers and decision makers, and potentially to the way that parks are governed in the city of Boston as a whole. And so, we start small in a safe space, but that's really the goal, is to share the agency and the power.
Kate, can I jump in too and say one thing? Okay. And I just want to say, adding on to what Smita and Stephen said, that when we don't have participatory modes of planning and governance that really prioritize those who have been underrepresented or, without power in these processes historically and in the present, what we do by default is prioritize this imagined public, which is, undoubtedly, and Audre Lorde coined this term mythical norm, right? And she talked about how in the US, the mythical norm is white, male, heterosexual, Christian, financially secure. And it's this unnamed sort of universal that public spaces and, all kinds of things get designed for, the sort of unspoken all whose needs and comforts are unconsciously and consciously upheld. So it's really important to make sure that we are intentional about who we include and whose comfort and needs and aspirations and existing plans we center. So I just so appreciate the work that Stephen and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy is doing in Boston. It's really important for us all. The other groups whose work I want to hold up in terms of development without displacement sort of toolkits is, besides ACT LA's Equity Planning Kit, which I shared out among the resources, the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative is also doing amazing work. It's no coincidence that both are movement-based initiatives that center low-income communities of color. So what they're doing is prioritizing the needs of longtime residents who've kept up the Bronx and LA, not imaginary newcomers, and they're planning around the existing cultures, the existing economic vitality that lives right now in these places. And I think that's really important that we look at what they're advocating for, and to get real concrete about some of the anti-displacement measures that they're advocating. It's inclusionary zoning, affordable housing policy, but also tenant protections, public housing improvements, tax subsidies, maintenance subsidies for low-income homeowners who are often vulnerable, right, to predatory, buyers and lenders. It's effectively decommodifying housing. And there's also local workforce hire provisions, support for minority and women-owned businesses, family-sustaining wages, employment benefits. So it's the other side of affordability, is income, being able to afford places, and just allowing people to live securely in their homes and with dignity.
And decommodifying housing, decommodification is one approach. I think another approach, or another way of thinking about it. Niall, no. If you didn't want the answer no, you should have walked away. He wants to watch the show. But I think also recognizing that as a commodity, which in this country is one of the center points of wealth, family wealth growth and generational wealth. And so when there are people who have stuck it out in neighborhoods that have been underinvested, and then the investment comes and the neighborhood starts changing, making sure that there are homeowner stabilization programs. And I'm sure, Lily, you're talking about some of these things. So not only for renters, obviously, oftentimes a majority of the people are renters, but there are also homeowners that will suddenly have their taxes go up and they can't afford to stay in their home, and they haven't been able to invest in the quality of their home for a number of years. And so even if they wanted to sell, they wouldn't get the true value. And so providing low interest loans, forgivable loans, is an example, in Cincinnati that the medical institutions instituted when they realized that they had been very predatory on the surrounding neighborhoods by devaluing land, buying up housing cheap, demolishing it and putting in surface parking and land banking until the next facility needed to be built. And so through another process, looking at a whole other thing that I'm not going to get into because it's too long, but one of the outcomes was this homeowner stabilization program that one of the institutions provided $35,000 forgivable loans, where people that were longtime homeowners, if they remained in their home for 5 years after receiving that loan, it was completely forgiven and turned into a grant, and that allowed them to upkeep their existing home and actually capitalize on the equity that they should have been gaining all along.
We have such an amazing number of questions that are popping up. So I want to give a shout out to Melissa Slater, who is foresaw one of the questions that we were going to ask. So I'm going to do a little hybrid here. We're talking a lot about pulling residents to the table and engaging in authentic shared leadership and decision models with residents. But how do you make sure that the right people are at the table? And how do you make sure that the table is right for the people who are invited there, who show up to it?
That's such a great question. Thank you, Melissa, for asking that. Yes, because when we talk about residents, right, who has the luxury, and the wherewithal to participate, to be informed, to show up, and to insert oneself into sort of public deliberations? It's highly uneven, and the work. So I think Audre Lorde's work that really breaks down sort of intersectionality in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, ableism, ageism. I often use that to sort of think about who is marginalized in what terms and who is missing from this table, and trying to understand like the fullness of communities and how those who are present and participating do not represent the fullness of the communities, and trying to oversample for those, and understanding that those who are most marginalized, and this is channeling bell hooks, right? The margins as spaces of resistance and radical openness, that people who experience the systemic dysfunction, so because places and infrastructures aren't designed for them, they know the best about why it's wrong and what needs to be fixed and what works. And so making sure that those groups are at the table informing decisions is really, really critical. And I think youth are some of the most overlooked groups who really know and are future looking and understand like intergenerational perspectives on issues as well.
Yeah, that's great. Those are great points, Lily. And I'll just add that, it reminded me of some of the work we did with the city of LA and LA Riverworks as they were developing the river redevelopment plan. And one of the things we initiated with them to really look at risks and vulnerabilities together. How can we make sure that, while we are looking at, while there were these many different plans and ideas about integrating kind of what originally started as an ecosystem restoration project, how can we make sure that we connect it and stitch it to the community needs? And what are the vulnerabilities of the community? So we really looked at, we ran what we call a resilience accelerator through the Rockefeller Foundation support, and we called in really stakeholders from all across the community, every civil society organization, representation from community themselves, in order to look at all shocks, stresses, and vulnerabilities in an integrated way for the city to really examine how they should be addressing both some of the kind of slow-moving stresses, the economic stresses, the old housing stock, the lack of investment over many decades in the communities, and how can we ensure that once these are looked at together, you actually develop an authentic risk narrative that is specific to that place, is specific to those communities and their needs, and then you generate the ideas for what needs to be done or what opportunities need to be explored based on that, right? So I think being authentic about how you will look at place-based action with the community, not only understanding it from the technical perspective, but also understanding from how communities often negotiate these, these risks from a community perspective is critical in order to support genuine engagement and, go back to the community to see how you'll create impact in the long term. I also agree. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Just one quick one, and then Stephen, it's all yours. I also think engaging youth, which Lily mentioned, I think is critical, because I think one is, as we have all seen, to me, it's quite obvious how youth have taken a leadership role in climate action globally. They understand that the risks that their generation face are real from climate risks, and so and they have genuinely kind of considered that as their imperative to not only take on the role of ensuring other actors look at climate risk seriously, but I think bringing in youth to take more ownership and action in looking at redevelopment renewal initiatives with the perspective of long-term development would be a great way to initiate some of this work in a more innovative and effective way.
I don't need to follow up. Let's leave time for as many questions as possible.
Neat. There's a great question that's coming in from Serena from Serena Travis about waterfronts. I feel like so many cities in the last 15, 20 years have discovered, like, oh, we've got a waterfront. Maybe we shouldn't put like our trash and our sewage in there, and we should develop it into places that can be used for commercial activity, for recreation, for residential spaces. But we've got a problem. We've got the climate crisis. We've got the really intensive land prices in waterfront areas because folks do want to live near clean water. What should we be thinking about from an environmental perspective, from a community development perspective, and from an equity perspective when we're considering opportunities for redeveloping and reusing land in waterfront areas? How do we think about that? Taking advantage of economic opportunity, preparing for the climate crisis. It's kind of like a big or something. It's just sort of a big thing.
I can help start us on that. I mean, the good news is there is now a lot of research and information on the clear benefits of kind of integrated gray-green strategies to address coastal risks in the future, right? So these strategies really look at how we can bring in nature to address those future risks that we see. And they really have now been tested and evaluated. We know that investing in mangroves can not only help you address sea level rise, storm surge issues, but actually improve quality of life. And so I think if there are communities that have that have only recently acknowledged their coastal lands and want to develop it. In some ways, it's good news because hopefully their coastal lands are not overexploited already and not damaged by growth and development. And hence, there is a more of an opportunity to make sure that the approaches that they take now are kind of these integrated approaches which will build on their natural assets to address future risks in a long way. And, there are many resources. Engineering with Nature is investing a lot in research on the US front, to support those kind of resources and knowledge to integrate planning in a way that takes into account future climate scenarios, but also looks at kind of hybrid infrastructures.
Yeah, I'd say if I was going to answer the question from the perspective of macro idealism, we should all be getting the heck away from the coastal edge, and we should be talking about retreat strategies that are viable. But from a sort of more localized pragmatist kind of perspective, we really need to take into account, as Smita was talking about earlier, the particular vulnerabilities of the communities which tend to be more in harm's way, not by choice. The condo folks are there by choice, but the folks that aren't there, and the pre-existing vulnerabilities that are in addition to and come before even the climate vulnerability, which are important to consider. But also figuring out how things work and trying to leverage the system and tap into it in some way to the benefit of others. One example, and this doesn't get to maybe the climate question, but it gets to the question of inclusive spaces, because as they redevelop, waterfronts in cities are not becoming developed as inclusive spaces, neither for the owners nor for the people who visit them. And so, working with the Massachusetts Port Authority, we were trying to find a way to leverage the reality of new big development, but to use some of the money which was already set aside for public realm investments prior to the development of the project in a kind of pre-development stage, and use that money to activate the sites, and again, give that money to curators and artists of color to imagine what's possible on the site in the couple of years leading up to its formal redevelopment. And that was not only an opportunity to bring people into space and give them some way to mark an identity in that space and have a sense of sort of temporary ownership, but then also to inform during design development what the more permanent format of the ground floor of those buildings could be, so that those kinds of activities and uses and people would have a space within the design of the building in a permanent format. And that extends all the way to the size and scale of the retail spaces, such that they're actually accessible to small and social enterprise businesses and businesses of color, so that there's actually a real ownership stake. Because when you see people from your neighborhood that have a business in a space, that space is your space as well. And if you are just there as a patron, then it's not necessarily going to be your space.
I am so bummed that we are like almost out of time. I feel like we could keep going for a million years with this radical energy. I'm so into it. The last question that I have, this is a 30 seconds or less lightning round before we pass it back to Claire and say goodbye to our wonderful guests. What advice do you have for planners, municipal folks, redevelopers whose hearts are in the right place and they're looking to up their equity game? 30 seconds or less. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I would say, just one thing, look at the entire, I would say, look at the entire resource chain. There are many innovations possible in, it kind of reminded me of New York City's Clean Soil Bank program, which helps promote remediation at the same time reduces impacts through greenhouse gas emissions, which are caused. So I would just say, don't look at systems and look at how you can influence factors in the system that can help promote more equitable, more sustainable resource management and human-centered, equity-based approaches. So continue to look at both place-based action, but system changes is what is on my mind, and I keep thinking of.
Thank you. Lily?
Sure, thanks. I agree with Smita. I think systems approach is really important, specifically taking a solidarity work on that, so that not to be too professionalized and project-based, but really thinking about who's already there, which frontline communities, organizers are already leading the work and trying to sort of accomplish and sync up. A systems and asset-based approach, I might add, sort of overcoming a dominant damage and deficit-centered perspective that we often impose on places that like need help, but really also seeing like the assets and the leadership and the visions that exist there. I would also say leaning into agonism, not just consensus. Like equity is the flip, we need equity because there's power disparities, and to address them, we need to build power together, we need to fight power. So I think being agonistic in the politics is really key, and not just fighting back, but fighting forward. Like what are the visions, affirmative sort of visions of the future that we want to help realize?
That's all amazing, and I would have probably tried to say some of it, and I won't. I'll say something else to add to it. Be process oriented and not sort of outcome oriented, because if you have a more inclusive process, you're going to have a better outcome and a better product at the end. And inclusion needs to be not about having just the process be about community engagement around a project which is already being discussed and has been kind of predefined, but the inclusion is going to be about the people who you want to engage about the project actually being the ones who are engaging you and themselves and others about the project. And you'll be doing it right when you feel like you've lost the power. But one thing that I think is interesting about people with power is that they fail to recognize and realize that the people who we look to as having the most power and being the most powerful are those who are able to give it away. When someone can give away their power, you really look at them with a different kind of respect. And so it's losing that power is not losing it. It's actually in some ways gaining it in some ways, but giving the decision-making power to communities themselves.
Well, folks, you heard it here first. Systems, solidarity, process-oriented. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. And thank you so much for our wonderful panelists who've just made my heart sing. I'm going to pass it back over to Claire. I did want to make a really quick plug that if you're interested in equity work, interested in equity-focused community engagement work, Groundwork USA does have a grant from the EPA to help you do equitable stuff with your brownfield site. So head over to groundworkusa.org, hit me up, and I can connect you to our free technical assistance. Thank you so much to our panelists, and I'll pass it back to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Cate, and I want to thank our panelists who are going to be jumping off because we all have very busy schedules, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And we talked a lot about sharing power and agency today and the importance of community engagement. And so I want to invite you to join us to continue the conversation. And there are a number of ways we can do that. First of all, I have your questions that you've asked, your incredible questions. I encourage you to fill out the survey at the end of this webinar, which will give you an opportunity to share your thoughts. I will share everything that you relay onto our panelists, so that's an opportunity to engage further. And I really want to invite you to CECLEAR's 6th Annual New York State Redevelopment Summit, Intentional Reinvention. We will have a keynote from the White House Environmental Advisory Council member and REACT Executive Director Peggy Shepard. We talked a little bit about the table and what does that mean and how do you make it and how do you bring people to it. And so we actually have a panel at the summit titled A Place at the Table, Driving Equitable Redevelopment Through Community Engagement. And the entire summit will touch on land reuse policy, practice, and priorities through an EJ lens. So I encourage you to check it out. There is a link to the full program in the chat. So I believe that's all for me. I want to thank Cate so much for being an excellent moderator and managing all of the questions as they came in, and for helping to organize this. And I will leave it there, and I hope you all have an incredible rest of your day. You can contact us at info@cclear.org with any technical assistance related questions on redevelopment and brownfields land reuse. Thank you, and have a really fantastic rest of your day. And don't forget to fill out that survey to relay your thoughts, and I'll pass those on. All right, have an excellent day, everyone, and we will stay in touch.